Hey guys, I chose to critique the case study from the Exxon Valdez Alaska oil spill from 1989. The reason why I chose this one is because one, it was in my lifetime. I remember it as a child back in '89, and two, in light of the 2010 BP oil spill in the Gulf of Mexico, I was curious to see what kind of connections these types of ecological disasters may have had as far as what we learned from 25 years ago and how we applied it to the most recent one in the Gulf of Mexico. Just covering the case study, I'll briefly discuss the different stages. In the case study, you are a lead of a state agency that's in charge or that has jurisdiction on the west coast of the U.S., including Alaska. It's March 24th. The Exxon Valdez oil tanker hits a reef along Prince William Sound up in Alaska. It turns out you dump about 42 million liters of oil, which equates to 11 million gallons of oil. In that first stage, it says that your job at this point is, one, to notify the Coast Guard, two, to survey the ship to try to contain any unleaked oil, and also to contact volunteers and veterinarians to help try to protect wildlife. Stage two of the incident, your oil has already spread to over 8 miles around an area. 1,300 miles of your coastline have been affected, as well as multiple species and different types of animals within the wildlife community have been affected. You're unable to contain the oil or burn it off, and you've also what your priority is at this point is to try to repair the rupture on the ship, and to move any wildlife that you can away from the spill to try to mitigate the amount of damage that actually occurs to the wildlife population. It also states at this point you need to stay in constant communication with local, state, and federal officials. They need to be remained informed, as well as they're a major resource for you. The key issues that the Exxon Valdez industrial accident bring up are, one, that mitigation is key. That you must work with government agencies to avoid similar mishaps. Obviously, this at the time, all the way up through to 2010 with the Gulf of Mexico BP oil spill, this is the most damaging financially, ecologically, any industrial oil spill has ever had in the world. Excuse me. Other key issues that were raised was one of the things that you might be able to consider in mitigation efforts is to avoid having any kind of oil tankers or any tankers that are carrying any kind of corrosive or hazardous material to do business in wild refuges or in any areas that are uninhabited where you have a high amount of wildlife. In the end, this thing ended up costing about $4.5 billion in damages, included some damages to wildlife that to date haven't recovered. Not to mention damaging the fishing industry and ecotourism and that sort of thing in that part of the world. I was able to pull up a few different articles. Again, the reason why I chose this case study is because I wanted to see what we learned from 25 years ago and how it was applied to the oil spill in the Gulf of Mexico. One of the articles that I found was from CNN.com, written by Mary Beth Holman. This was written March 25th, 2014, and this was about the 25th anniversary of the Exxon Valdez spill. I'm just going to highlight a couple of things that it mentioned. It mentioned that the sound, the Prince William Sound, the coastal ecosystem today is still permanently damaged. Thousands of gallons of the oil still pollute the beaches. The oil is still toxic, and it still hurts the ecosystem near the shore. It goes on to mention some of the wildlife populations. 13 of the 32 monitored wildlife populations, habitats, and resource services that were injured in the spill are fully recovered. But there are multiple wildlife populations that to date have not recovered and are actually in stages of going extinct or not recovering. The one that they highlighted here was a pod of orcas, where 15 of the 22 members after the spill had died. They haven't been able to produce any calves, and there's only one older female orca that is left in the pod, and scientists tend to agree that the orcas will go extinct. This article also mentions that there's persistent oil poisoning and a cascade of ecological effects that continue to date. And truthfully, there's not much, according to this article, that can be done for Prince William Sound short of protecting it from this happening again. Then this is an opinion piece. So then she starts to interject her opinion. She says that, for example, or she says that the only real solution to issues like this is to stop using oil. She said that seldom in situations like this, whether it was the Prince William Sound spill or the Exxon Valdez spill or the Gulf of Mexico, that very seldomly more than 10% of the spilled oil is ever recovered. She mentions an irony in the situation that today, currently in 2014, there's still a very large push for Arctic oil drilling, and the irony that she highlights is that polar bears, the ice in the Arctic region is shrinking, mostly due in part to greenhouse gases and the warming of the world. And ironically, we are still going into the Arctic to try to drill for this deep oil, which in turn is damaging the environment. So we're using the Arctic to further damage the Arctic and really the world in general. Another article I found was from the New York Times, written in 2010. This was just after the spill, the BP spill in the Gulf of Mexico. It mentioned some of the same stuff I've mentioned already, that the tanker Valdez oil, the tanker, it spilled 15 million gallons of crude oil, staining 1,500 miles of coastline, killing hundreds of thousands of seabirds, otters, seals, and whales, devastating local communities. And this, the author is William Yardley. He goes on to say that the recovery may not have an end date. He states that one particular fishing niche that has not recovered is the herring fishery. That herring, back prior to Exxon Valdez, was one of the most profitable fishing industry niches in that part of the Pacific Ocean, and that some of the other fish populations have recovered, but that the herring fishery to date is gone. That it is almost completely wiped out herring fishing up in that part of the world. Let's see what else he mentioned. That's it from that article. I found another article from EcoWatch.com, written by Chris Robbins and Bob Spies. And this is one that I found. The title of the article is BP Disaster Recovery Through the Lens of the Exxon Valdez Oil Spill. I'm going to quote here directly. He says, they state, 4 years after the tanker Exxon Valdez belched 11 million gallons of oil into Prince William Sound, the water surface was largely oil-free. However, patches of asphalt-like deposits remained on area beaches, and pockets of relatively fresh oil could be found below the surface. Residual BP oil persists. This is the oil from the Gulf. It states that it persists embedded in marshes, beaches, and offshore sediments. When disturbed, as was the case following Tropical Storm Karen, it re-oils sensitive habitats. So lingering oil poses risks to the species and can slow recovery either through direct re-exposure or indirectly through ingestion of contaminated prey. So you get oil in the Gulf of Mexico. This is pretty intuitive and obvious. Oil, and then you have some of the bottom feeders and some of the lower food chain marine life that consumes this oil, and obviously bigger fish eat those and bigger fish eat that, and ultimately us human beings are eating this fish. So we don't even know what the direct health effects are going to be from the oil spills. It's going to take years, and most of the time it'll probably be attributed to some cancer with unknown origin. But what he mentioned in this, what I just read to you, that was obviously kind of disturbing to me, is that it says anytime that there's a tropical storm in the Gulf of Mexico or any kind of storm that gets some storm surge and some winds, it's almost as though you're getting oil reintroduced into the water. And this happens all the time, every year, with hurricane season and storm season. So what he's trying to say is that the effects of the oil in the Gulf aren't really going to be totally understood for years. Much like Exxon Valdez, to date, 25 years later, recovery hasn't been completed, nor will it ever be completed. He goes on to talk about the bluefin tuna in the Gulf of Mexico and how the oil affects their anatomy. What else did he mention here? And how we don't know exactly how it's going to affect the populations of bluefin tuna in the Gulf of Mexico. He also mentioned that bottlenose dolphin, have experienced the largest and worst ever seen die-off in the history of the Gulf of Mexico. And he finishes by stating that we need dedicated Gulf-wide monitoring for a minimum of 25 years to track recovery from the BP disaster. If there's one lesson we've learned from the Exxon Valdez disaster, is that good science is the glove that fits around the hand of restoration. So what I'm getting at with what I've found, the information that I found, is that when that amount of oil, or really when any amount of oil enters the marine ecosystem, the effects are long standing. Recovery is never fully complete, and that the amount of damage that is done to the ecosystem and to marine life, which in effect affects us as animals that eat a large portion of the marine biology, it affects us too, and in countable ways. And it takes years to actually understand exactly how bad an oil spill of that magnitude affects the entire world and the entire ecosystem. A side note, I found another article that and I'm assuming that this is more fact than opinion, but that the ship's captain of the Exxon Valdez, his name was Joseph J. Hazelwood, that he left the bridge during a crucial moment right before the Exxon Valdez hit the reef. And it has been reported that Mr. Hazelwood, who is a known alcoholic, had downed 5 double vodkas on the night of the disaster, according to witnesses on the Exxon Valdez. So go figure. Drunk captains piloting big oil tankers through very delicate marine ecosystems usually ends in disaster. Thank you, guys.